Imagine this. You finally decide to quit sugar. You toss the sodas, skip the desserts, and you start reaching for what you've been told is the healthier option, agave. After all, it's natural, low on glycemic index, and it's found in all those organic, health-conscious products. But then something strange happens. You're not losing weight. Your energy still crashes, and then your doctor tells you that your liver enzymes are up. What's going on here? Hello, health champions. Today we're going to talk about what you really need to know about agave versus white sugar as a sweetener. And we need to understand the differences between the two in terms of glycemic index, how they affect your blood sugar, how they affect your liver, and how they affect your metabolic health, or in other words, your insulin resistance. Agave is also known as agave nectar. And nectar, that sounds like really super positive. It's like the food of the gods, right? It's something supernatural. And agave is often promoted as natural. And they're not totally wrong. It's natural, just like sugar, in the sense that it's made from a plant, but it is highly processed in that they extract the sugar out of that plant. It is also promoted as having a low glycemic index, which is absolutely true. It hardly raises your blood sugar at all, but therefore it's also promoted as being diabetes friendly because diabetics always try to control their blood sugar. But the question is that true, and is it better or worse than sugar? But because of this reputation, agave is often considered for what people think of as healthy products. So when people drink teas and they eat snacks and they get wellness products that they believe are healthy, very often they're going to have agave in them. And a lot of this marketing and a lot of this reputation is very, very misleading. And we're going to talk about this in detail. But it's also fueled, it's backed up by the mainstream medicine's almost single-minded focus on blood sugar as opposed to the whole metabolic picture. So if you switch from sugar to agave, in the very beginning, you might see that your blood glucose looks a little bit better at first. However, you might also notice that your cravings continue, and you might notice that your belly fat goes up initially. So you're still feeding that sugar addiction, but you're kind of doing it in disguise because it seems like your blood sugar is getting a little better. But again, we need to understand the bigger picture here. If you watched some of my videos before, you've probably seen me do this illustration, but it's critical that we understand that sucrose is actually two different sugars. So table sugar, sucrose, white sugar, has a sugar in it with six carbon ring called glucose. And then next to it is a 5-ring carbon. It still has 6 carbons, but it's kind of off to the side. So molecular formula is the exact same thing, but the configuration is different, and that makes all the difference. So we have glucose, we have fructose. If we link them together, it becomes sucrose, and this is white table sugar. But here's the hidden metabolic trap that we need to understand, that if you are a 200-pound person, hypothetically, then you have 200 pounds of cells in your body, and you have 200 pounds of cells that can use glucose. Every cell in your body can use glucose, but you only have 3 pounds of cells, that's the weight of your liver, that can metabolize the fructose. So if we have 50%, let's say you eat 100 grams of sucrose, of sugar. Now we have 50 grams of glucose that can be evenly divided by all the cells of your body, 200 pounds of cells. But these 50 grams of fructose is going to go exclusively only to the cells of the liver. So in terms of overloading a cell with sugar, we are 66 times more likely to overload the liver than we are any other cell in the body when it comes to sugar. And when we overload that liver, now the sugar turns into fat. That fructose gets converted into fat, also known as triglycerides, which circulate around in your bloodstream. They're there to deliver this fat to the cells for fuel, which would be a good thing unless the sugar also drove up the insulin, because when insulin is high, now the cells don't receive these triglycerides. It's resisting the fuel. With insulin resistance, it's resisting the glucose, but it's also resisting the triglycerides. And therefore, the triglycerides get manufactured in the liver, but then they stick around in the bloodstream. So now you end up with high triglycerides. And over time, this is what leads to the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And this is how fructose contributes 66 times more to fatty liver than glucose does, basically. So while diabetes and prediabetes are often evaluated based on blood glucose, that's the primary thing that they're tracking, the bigger problem is a fatty liver and insulin resistance. This is at the core of metabolic disease. Now, we still want to track blood glucose, but that's merely the symptom. That's just the end result, the expression of that fatty liver and the insulin resistance. So when you have a fatty liver, that fatty liver is an insulin-resistant liver. And now, because of that, you're going to have elevated levels of insulin because insulin isn't working because of the resistance in the body cells. And because the insulin isn't working, now your blood glucose is also going to go up. Furthermore, you're going to have a disruption in your energy metabolism. Your body's ability to turn food into energy is going to be affected because high levels of insulin is going to put you into energy storage mode. When we have metabolic flexibility, the body is allowing insulin to rise and fall, but when you're insulin resistant, it stays high, and now you're stuck in energy storage. And here's the key that we need to understand in terms of evaluating fructose and metabolic disease, that fructose drives this process. It drives the process of fatty liver and insulin resistance, and it ends up causing elevated blood sugar, but it does it without directly raising blood sugar. So you don't get more blood sugar. You don't raise your blood sugar by eating fructose directly, but down the road, it raises your blood sugar more than anything else. So let's take a quick look at the stats here of the numbers involved. So if we compare glucose and fructose, which are these two, in sucrose, we got 50% of each. So if we compare the glycemic index, so glucose has 100% glucose and fructose is pure fructose. Now, glucose is the reference point. So that value of glycemic index is set to 100 because everything else is compared to glucose. Now, fructose is only going to be 20. It's going to be a very low glycemic food, even by my standards. And sucrose is just the technical name for sugar, table sugar, white sugar. And like we said, it has 50% of each. So the glycemic index ends up somewhere in between. So the speed with which the food goes into the bloodstream and becomes blood sugar, that's a marker of 65. Now, high fructose corn syrup, high fructose, suggests that there is more fructose than in regular sugar, which it is. So we have about 55% fructose versus 45% glucose. And that number can vary a little bit, but that's like the standard high fructose corn syrup that they use. And now we're going to see a slightly lower glycemic index because there is more fructose, which is absorbed slower. It doesn't really become blood glucose at all. It only does it indirectly after the liver has had a chance to process it. But now take a look at this. Agave, this supposed health food, has 20% of glucose and 80% fructose. And again, depending on the plant and how they process it and so forth, these numbers could vary a little bit. It could be as low as 10 or it could be as high as 30. But roughly speaking, this is where we're looking at. And as a result, the glycemic index is only 25. So it is a very low glycemic index. And that's why some people think that this is good for diabetes because it doesn't raise blood sugar. Well, like we said, blood sugar is the symptom. It's not the root cause. So even though agave has the lowest blood glucose impact, it has the greatest liver impact in terms of creating a fatty liver and metabolic disease. So there are two popular things that only the liver can process, and that's fructose and that's alcohol. So what do you think about putting agave into alcoholic beverages, into mixed drinks and cocktails instead of sugar? Well, you're really doing the absolute worst of both worlds. First, you're putting alcohol in there, and now it would be bad enough to put sucrose because you're getting 50% of the fructose, but now by putting agave in there and making it sound like a specially luxurious drink, you're actually upping the fructose from 50 to 80% in addition to that alcohol. So let's talk a little bit in detail about who should or who should not eat agave. I think it's pretty clear based on what we talked about that the people who shouldn't eat agave at all would be people who are insulin resistant, pre-diabetic, or have type 2 diabetes, because the fructose in the agave would just fuel that insulin resistance and increase the burden on the liver. If you have a fatty liver or elevated liver enzymes, same thing, you're just increasing the stress on the liver. If you have high triglycerides, then more fructose is going to make it worse. If you regularly drink alcohol, now there's already that burden on the liver. And even if your liver can handle a moderate intake of alcohol without any drawbacks, you don't want to add to the burden unnecessarily. If you have a sedentary lifestyle, that lack of movement doesn't help you to burn off anything, because with all metabolic disease, exercise still helps as an outlet to get rid of things, to burn things off. And if you have already a high sugar and high carb intake, then you don't want to add fructose to that. So in this video, when we mostly talked about the sugar, table sugar, which is glucose and fructose, and explain why that is, but even carbs in general, which things like rice and bread, they're basically pure glucose, which does not enter into this discussion about fructose that we've had, but that high glucose still drives insulin and makes it harder for the body to process anything to do with fatty liver or insulin resistance. So basically, if any of these things are true for you, then you need to avoid both sugar and agave, but realize that in this comparison, agave is the worst of the two. So after that long discussion about how agave has more fructose and fructose causes all these different things, is it even possible that someone could benefit from agave? Well, let's talk about it. Who should or who maybe could eat some agave instead of sugar? So if you are metabolically healthy already, if you have low fasting insulin, if your triglyceride levels are nice and low, if you are low in your consumption of alcohol, you might drink occasionally, you might have a couple of drinks now and then, but not massive amounts every day, then there is no chronic liver burden. Your liver is keeping up. So adding a little bit of agave wouldn't set the liver back. If you have a physically active lifestyle, and if you have a low sugar and carb intake already, now it could actually be an advantage to use agave instead of sugar because you would be eating something with a lower glycemic index. So you would have less blood sugar spikes. And yes, you would be adding a small amount of metabolic burden, but not more than your body can handle because you already have a good metabolic capacity. And this, of course, doesn't mean that you should start eating cups worth of the stuff. I think that everyone would do well to keep their added sugar below 20 grams per day. So what would happen if we did this for 30 days? Well, if you were, like we talked about, metabolically healthy already, then you probably wouldn't see any significant difference. Because if you're metabolically healthy, then you're having a lifestyle that's already good, and then you could afford up to maybe 20 grams plus minus a little bit on average, because it's not a big deal. Your body can handle it. And it didn't really matter if you use sugar or agave, but you could be enjoying slightly more stable blood sugar. And that's always a good thing because the blood sugar could give you some cravings if you start swinging a lot with that. But again, at the quantities we talked about, you probably wouldn't see much difference. However, in people with insulin resistance, prediabetes, or type 2 diabetes, you would increase the burden on your liver by switching from sugar to agave. You would increase the fructose, make it harder for your liver to keep up. You would make it worse in terms of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and you could see a further elevation in liver enzymes. And you would be overall driving your metabolic disease forward. You would be progressing your metabolic disease. So if you made it this far in the video, I want to congratulate you because you are in a minority who actually want to learn, and you will benefit so much from understanding how the body works as opposed to the people who are so impatient and they always say things like, just tell me what the good foods are. Well, it's going to be different for different people. And by learning these things from the ground up, you will have a huge advantage and you won't get misled by these false marketing claims and this hyper focus on blood sugar and in treating symptoms. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.